within 48 hours. Chapter 1. Keke and Tony were kicking it at the park, messing around like they always did. The sun was setting, throwing that golden hour light all over the place. They were pushing and shoving each other, laughing loud enough to make folks look their way. "You too slow, Tony," Keke teased, ducking his playful grabs. "Just wait till I catch you," he laughed, finally wrapping his arms around her waist. They both dropped onto the grass, breathing heavy and giggling. Keke checked her watch and sighed. "I gotta bounce, Tony. The kid's probably wondering where I am." Tony nodded, pulling her up. "8, drive safe. Catch you later." As Keke drove home, the smile on her face started to fade. Eric's car was parked outside her crib. It wasn't unusual for her baby daddy to visit the kids, but he usually called first. Today, he hadn't. Keke took a deep breath and walked inside. The kids were playing in the living room, and Eric was chilling on the couch, looking through some papers. "Hey, Eric," Keke said, trying to keep it cool. "Didn't know you were coming today." Eric looked up, his face blank. "Came to grab some work for a play. Thought I'd spend time with the kids." Keke nodded, feeling the tension. Eric's eyes were narrowing as he looked her over. "Where you been?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Out with a friend," Keke replied, trying to keep it light. "Just needed some air." "Which friend?" Eric's tone got harder. "Tony," Keke said, immediately regretful. Eric's face turned dark. "Tony, huh?" He stood up, coming toward her. "Let me see your phone." Keke hesitated, but Eric snatched it from her hand. He scrolled through her messages, his jaw clenching when he saw Tony's name. "Who's this?" he demanded, showing her the text. "Just Tony," Keke said, backing away. "We're friends, that's all." Eric's anger exploded. He punched Keke in the nose, dropping her to the floor. Blood poured from her nose, but she got back up, ready to fight. Chapter 2. Keke and Eric's fight got wilder, the sounds of their struggle echoing through the house. The kids were crying, huddled in a corner, scared out of their minds. Keke managed to get a few hits in, but Eric was too strong. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. "Police, open up!" Keke and Eric froze. They stopped fighting, the room going silent. The knock-in continued, but when nobody answered, the police eventually left. Breathing heavy, Keke and Eric stared each other down. This wasn't their first rodeo, and it probably wouldn't be the last. After another round of yelling, they finally calmed down, both exhausted. "I'm sorry," Eric muttered, rubbing his temples. I can't stand thinking about you with someone else." Keke sighed, wiping the blood from her face. "We can't keep doing this, Eric. It's bad for the kids." Eric nodded, but they both knew it was just talk. He left shortly after, leaving Keke to clean up and comfort the kids. Once the kids were settled, Keke called Tony. She needed someone who understood. "Hey, Keke," Tony answered, his voice full of concern. "You okay?" "No, Tony, I'm not," Keke said, her voice shaking. "Eric was here. We fought again," Tony sighed. "You need to call the cops next time, Keke. This can't keep happening." "I know," she whispered, tears rolling down her face. "I know." Chapter 3. The next day, Keke met up with Tony at their favourite spot, a small diner on the edge of town. They sat in a corner booth, far from prying eyes. Keke sipped her coffee, her hands trembling as she recounted the events of the previous night. "I can't keep living like this, Tony," Keke said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eric's out of control." Tony reached across the table, taking her hand. "You don't have to, Keke. You got me now. We'll figure this out." Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the diner seemed to fade away. The world outside ceased to exist, and it was just the two of them, finding comfort in each other's presence. Tony's touch was a lifeline, pulling Keke from the depths of her despair. As the hours passed, their conversation grew more intimate. One thing led to another, and soon they found themselves in a motel room, seeking solace in each other's arms. The air was thick with tension, their bodies moving in sync as they tried to drown out the chaos of their lives. Later, Tony met up with his boy Dave at Dave's place, a rundown apartment in a sketchy part of town. The place reeked of stale beer and cigarette smoke. They sat on the worn-out couch, a few beers in hand. "I met this girl," Tony said, staring at his drink. "Keke, she's going through a lot at home." Dave's eyes widened. "Keke, like Eric's girl, Keke?" Tony looked up, surprised. You know her? Dave nodded. Yeah, I know her. Eric's a big-time dealer in Tampa, but he lives in Orlando. We could make a come-up. Come up how? Tony asked, frowning. Dave leaned in, a sly grin on his face. We could rob Eric and set Keke up. Think about it, man. We could get a lot of money. Tony hesitated, but the idea was already taken root. They talked it over, planning their next move. The excitement in the room was palpable, an adrenaline rush coursing through their veins as they plotted the heist. Chapter 4. Dave and Tony linked up with their big homie Carl, going over the details of their plan in the back room of a dimly lit bar. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. Carl, a seasoned criminal with a reputation for meticulous planning, laid out the blueprint for the heist. Here's how it's going to go down, Carl said, his voice low and gravelly. Eric's got a stash at Keke's place. We hit it tonight. Tony, you give the signal once Keke's out of the house. Dave and I will handle the rest. Tony nodded, the weight of the plan settling on his shoulders. The stakes were high, but the potential payout was worth the risk. The next day, Eric rolled back into town. He needed to grab some drugs for a deal and decided to pop up on Keke. His anger from the previous encounter still simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over. As soon as he walked in, Eric snatched Keke's phone. The first name he saw from last night was Tony's. His rage exploded. You with him again? He yelled, grabbing Keke by the throat and slamming her through the living room table. Glass shattered everywhere, the sound piercing the silence of the house. He punched and slapped her, leaving her bruised and bleeding. After his outburst, he grabbed a bag from their room and stormed out. Keke assumed he had taken his things and left for good. She immediately called Tony, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. Chapter 5. Tony convinced Keke to call the cops and get Eric arrested. Reluctantly, Keke did what he suggested. Within hours, a warrant was out for Eric. The police picked him up in Orlando later that day. The sense of relief was palpable, but it was tinged with anxiety. Keke knew that Eric's arrest was just the beginning of a new kind of chaos. Emotionally and physically wrecked, Keke agreed to let Tony take her out to calm her nerves. They drove aimlessly through the city, the streets a blur of neon lights and dark shadows. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a background to their shared silence. You did the right thing, Keke, Tony said finally, breaking the silence. Eric's where he belongs. Keke nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and she felt trapped between fear and uncertainty. While they were out, Tony sent the signal to Dave and Carl to make their move. It was a simple text, but it set off a chain of events that would change everything. Dave and Carl met up early in the morning, going over the final details of their plan. They knew Eric had a stash at Keke's place, and tonight was the night to hit it. Tony's signal had come through, and they were ready to move. They drove to Keke's neighborhood, parking a few blocks away to avoid suspicion. Dressed in dark clothes and gloves, they moved silently through the shadows, approaching the house. The street was quiet, everyone else either asleep or too busy with their own lives to notice two figures sneaking around. Dave picked the lock on the back door with practiced ease. They slipped inside, closing the door softly behind them. The house was dark, only the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. They stood still for a moment, listening for any signs of movement. Nothing but silence. Let's make this quick, Carl whispered. They split up. Carl headed to the kitchen while Dave went toward the bedrooms. Carl started with the cabinets, rummaging through dishes and cereal boxes. He knew from experience that people like to hide things in plain sight. In the bedroom, Dave searched through the closet, tossing clothes aside. He checked under the bed, behind the dresser, and in every drawer. Nothing. He moved to the nightstand, opening the drawers and feeling around for hidden compartments. Still nothing. Frustrated, Dave walked back into the hall, meeting Carl's eyes. Anything? Carl shook his head. Not yet. Keep looking. They moved to the bathroom, searching through medicine cabinets, under the sink, and even in the toilet tank. Still no luck. Time was ticking, and they couldn't afford to stay too long. Check the kids' room, Carl suggested. Sometimes people hide stuff where they think no one will look. Dave nodded and slipped into the kids' room. He felt a pang of guilt seeing the toys and stuffed animals scattered around. but he pushed it aside, knowing he had a job to do. He searched through the toy chest, the dresser, and even the small closet. Finally, behind a stack of board games, he found a small safe. "Found something," he hissed. Carl joined him, eyes glinting with excitement. "Can you open it?" Dave nodded, pulling out a set of tools. He worked quickly, his fingers deft and sure. Within minutes, the safe clicked open. Inside, they found a stash of cash, several bags of pills, and a few small bags of powder. "Jackpot!" Carl grinned, grabbing the loot and stuffing it into a bag. "Check the rest of the house," Dave said. "Make sure we got everything." They continued their search, finding more cash hidden in a cereal box in the kitchen and a few more bags of drugs taped under a chair. Finally satisfied, they made their way back to the kitchen, ready to leave. As they approached the back door, Carl paused, looking back at the living room. "Hold up. What if we leave a few pills behind? Make it look like she's a user. Throw the cops off our trail." Dave considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Good idea." Carl pulled out a few pills from the stash and placed them in the kitchen cabinet. "There. That should do it." They slipped out the back door, locking it behind them. Moving quickly and quietly, they made their way back to the car, adrenaline pumping through their veins. "Let's get out of here," Carl said as they climbed in. Dave started the car, and they drove off, leaving Keke's neighborhood behind. They had what they came for, and now it was time to lay low and wait for the heat to die down. Tony and Keke wrapped up their night together, oblivious to what had just gone down. Tony took her home, and Keke, exhausted, went straight to bed. She didn't notice the open window or the mess left behind. Chapter 6. In the early hours, Keke was jolted awake by a loud, insistent knock at the door. Her heart raced as she stumbled out of bed, the remnants of the previous night's chaos flashing through her mind. She peeked through the blinds and her blood ran cold. It was Child Protective Services and the police. Panic surged through her veins. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called Tony, her voice trembling. "Tony, they're here. CPS and the cops. They want to search the house. What do I do?" "Stay calm, Keke. I'll be there as soon as I can. Just let them in," Tony said, trying to keep his voice steady. Keke took a deep breath and opened the door. The officers and CPS workers pushed past her, their faces set with grim determination. They began to search the house methodically, pulling open drawers, overturning cushions, and inspecting every nook and cranny. "Ma'am, we received a tip about drugs in the house," one of the officers said, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about," Keke stammered, trying to sound convincing. But fear was clawing at her insides. Suddenly, one of the officers called out from the kitchen. "Found something!" He held up a small bag of pills, the evidence that would seal her fate. Keke's world spun as they read her rights and handcuffed her. She was being arrested for possession, the weight of the charges pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. The CPS worker took the kids, their tear-streaked faces looking back at her as they were led away. In the squad car, Keke's mind raced. How had it come to this? What had Tony done? She had trusted him, and now she was paying the price. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Tony was already in his car, racing toward Keke's house. He had to make sure everything went according to plan. As he drove, he dialed Dave's number. "Yo, Dave. The cops are at Keke's place. They found the stash. You and Carl need to disappear for a while." "Got it. We'll lay low," Dave replied, the line going dead. Tony's mind was a whirlwind. He knew he had to get out of town, but there was one last thing he needed to do. He pulled up to Keke's house, just as they were putting her in the squad car. She caught his eye, her face a mix of betrayal and desperation. "Tony, help me!" she cried out, her voice breaking. But Tony just shook his head, knowing there was nothing he could do now. He watched as they drove away, the sirens fading into the distance. His phone buzzed with a message from Dave. "We're good, heading out." Tony took a deep breath and started his car. He had the money, he had the drugs, and now he had to disappear. He drove through the night, the city lights blurring into a haze of neon and darkness. He was leaving Tampa behind, heading for Chicago with everything he'd ever wanted. But as the miles rolled by, a sense of unease settled over him. Keke was tougher than he'd given her credit for. And Eric, still locked up, wouldn't stay there forever. The pieces were in play, and Tony knew that the game was far from over. In the holding cell, Keke sat on the cold, hard bench, her mind racing. She had to find a way out of this mess. She thought about Tony, about the betrayal, and about Eric. The storm was far from over, and she knew she had to brace herself for what was coming next. As the dawn broke, Keke made a silent vow. She would fight back. She wouldn't let Tony or Eric or anyone else control her life. The game was far from over, and she was just getting started. The door to the cell block clanged open, and a guard stepped in. "Visitor for you," he said. Keke's heart pounded as she stood up. She had no idea who it could be, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning.